It was upon an evening in late autumn, when the damp fingers of London's ever-present fog curled about the gas lamps and hung in languid tendrils across Baker Street, that I found myself once again in the company of my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. He had spent the better part of the afternoon in one of his singular moods, stretched languidly upon the settee, with his long fingers interlaced, his piercing grey eyes half-lidded in thought. The fire in the grate flickered weakly, barely holding its own against the damp chill that had crept in from the streets, and a silence had settled upon the room, punctuated only by the occasional distant clip of hooves upon cobblestone. I had been perusing the evening paper, though my thoughts wandered, drawn by the oppressive stillness of the night. There was a weight in the air, an unspoken unease that neither Holmes nor I had yet addressed. At length, I cast the paper aside and turned to him. "You are uncommonly quiet this evening, Holmes." He did not stir. "A quiet night is but an illusion, Watson," he murmured. "London never truly sleeps. It only waits." I had learned long ago that his cryptic utterances were often the prelude to some revelation, and I studied him carefully. His gaze remained fixed upon the ceiling, but there was a sharpness to his expression, an anticipation that suggested his mind was already 2 steps ahead of the present moment. The clock upon the mantelpiece struck 9. Even as its chime faded into the stillness, a sudden, insistent rap, rap, rap at the door shattered the quiet. I started in my chair, but Holmes had already sat upright, his eyes alight with something dangerously close to amusement. "You see, Watson," he said, rising swiftly to his feet. "London waits, but not for long." Mrs. Hudson's muffled voice sounded in the hall, and a moment later our late-night caller stepped into the room. His face, even in the dim light, was a study in urgency. It was Inspector Lestrade. Lestrade's usually ruddy complexion was paler than I had ever seen it, and there was a peculiar tightness about his mouth as he stepped forward, his coat still damp from the mist outside. Without preamble, he produced a folded sheet of parchment from his pocket and extended it toward Holmes. "I'm sorry to intrude at this hour, Mr. Holmes, but we've received a letter, a warning." Holmes took the paper, his long fingers handling it with delicate precision. He unfolded it and, as his eyes flicked across its contents, the sharp angles of his face grew ever more intent. I moved to his side, reading over his shoulder. The letter was brief, yet chilling. "London will burn at midnight. It is written in the embers of the past, and the reckoning is at hand." There was no signature. The ink had bled slightly into the parchment, the edges of the page marked by what appeared to be scorching, as though it had been held too close to an open flame. Lestrade exhaled sharply. "We received it an hour ago at Scotland Yard. No indication of who sent it. Just this." Holmes turned the paper over in his hands, bringing it closer to the lamp. His voice, when he spoke, was eerily calm. "This is not ordinary ink," he murmured. "There is iron gall in this composition, an old formula, no longer in common use." I cast him a questioning glance. "And the significance of that?" He did not answer me at once. Instead, he examined the burned edges with great care, holding the paper against the light before turning his gaze back to Lestrade. "You said you received this an hour ago?" Lestrade nodded. Holmes laid the letter down upon the table. "Then I suggest, gentlemen, that we do not waste another hour." He stepped toward his coat and hat. "If London is to burn at midnight, we must find where the first ember has fallen." Holmes remained silent for several moments after delivering his pronouncement, his gaze fixed upon the letter, as though willing it to yield its secrets. He turned it over between his fingers, tilting it toward the lamplight, his keen eyes scrutinizing every fiber of the parchment. "The handwriting," he murmured at last, "is deliberately unnatural. The slant is inconsistent, and there are hesitations in the strokes, as though the writer were unaccustomed to forming the letters in this manner." Lestrade furrowed his brow. "So it's a forgery." Holmes shook his head. "No, Inspector. It is a deception, certainly, but not in the sense you imply. The writer sought to obscure his natural hand. Whether out of fear or under duress, we shall determine." He placed the letter upon the table and gestured toward the burned edges. These scorch marks. Observe the way the fibers have curled. The flame was drawn along the paper with precision, not at random. Someone wished to suggest fire, yet not destroy the message entirely. It is a calculated effect. Watson leaned closer. And the ink? Holmes dipped his fingers into a small dish of water, running them over the writing. The liquid beaded atop the ink rather than spreading. Iron gall, he announced, a formulation that has fallen out of modern use. Its presence suggests an origin tied to archival records, libraries, or institutions that still employ traditional methods of preservation. Lestrade exhaled impatiently. It's a fine bit of analysis, Mr. Holmes, but what does it mean? Do we treat this as a genuine threat? Holmes lifted his gaze to meet the inspector's. The ink is rare, the phrasing deliberate, the fire intentional. A hoax would not be so careful in its craftsmanship. No, Inspector, this warning is not merely a message. He tapped the parchment with a long finger. It is a declaration. Holmes leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. There are elements here, Watson, that trouble me more than the threat itself. I frowned. More than an entire city being set ablaze. He ignored my remark. Consider the structure of the message. It does not warn of fire, it promises it. Written in the embers of the past. What does that suggest to you? Lestrade scoffed. Some lunatic invoking history to make himself sound important. Holmes's expression darkened. History is seldom invoked without reason, Inspector. The reference to embers suggests a prior fire, one that holds meaning for the writer. The Great Fire of London, I muttered. Holmes inclined his head. Precisely. But why now? Why, after centuries, would a long-dead inferno warrant a reckoning in the present? Lestrade sighed. And where does that leave us, then? Holmes stood abruptly. It leaves us with a pattern, Inspector. The ink, the phrasing, the deliberate presentation of this letter. It is the work of a mind consumed not with destruction alone, but with purpose. Revenge, perhaps. A reckoning, as it claims. And if that is the case... He glanced toward the darkened window. Then London is already in danger. I shivered, though the fire still burned in the hearth. You believe the attack has begun? Holmes took up his coat, his movements swift and decisive. Watson, when one sees smoke curling from the distance, does one wait until the flames are visible before raising the alarm? Lestrade gathered his hat, his expression wary. Where are we going? Holmes paused only to glance at the letter once more, to find where the first ember fell. Lestrade placed the letter upon Holmes's desk with a care I had rarely seen him exercise. His usual brusqueness had been replaced by a wary unease, and as Holmes unfolded the parchment, I could not help but lean forward, my curiosity fully engaged. It arrived at Scotland Yard an hour before I came here, Lestrade explained. No return address, no indication of who sent it, just this. Holmes held the paper delicately, his fingers running along its edges. No smudging, he murmured. No extraneous markings. It has not passed through many hands. He tilted it toward the lamplight, the flickering glow revealing subtle irregularities. And yet, note the parchment itself. It is thick, fibrous, and of a make not commonly found in stationers' shops. Lestrade crossed his arms. And what does that mean? It suggests an uncommon origin, Holmes replied. This is not the product of a hurried note dashed off in secrecy. It was prepared with deliberation. I watched as he traced the writing with his fingertip, his eyes narrowing. The handwriting is curious, he remarked. A natural hand would exhibit fluidity in its strokes, yet here we find hesitation, as if the writer were consciously disguising his own script. Observe how the letters lack uniformity. Certain curves exaggerated, others stilted. I frowned. Could it not simply be an unpracticed hand? Holmes shook his head. This is deliberate obfuscation, Watson. Someone sought to conceal their identity, not through false names, but through the very act of writing. He turned his attention to the burn mark at the edge of the parchment. And this? Lestrade prompted. Careless handling, perhaps? Holmes's lips curved slightly. On the contrary, Inspector, it is far too precise to be accidental. This letter was burned with intention, not to destroy, but to invoke a message. He laid the letter upon the table, his expression unreadable. "We are not dealing with a mere threat," he murmured. "Whoever wrote this did so not of their own volition, but under duress. The true hand behind it remains hidden." Holmes reached for a small dish of water upon his desk, dipping a clean brush into the liquid before running it lightly over the edge of the writing. I watched in fascination as the ink did not spread, but instead beaded against the parchment surface. "Iron gall," he announced. Lestrade's brows drew together. "Is that significant?" Holmes set the brush down and regarded us both with a measured gaze. Iron gall ink was once the standard for legal and archival documents, but its use has dwindled with the advancement of modern formulations. Its presence here suggests that our writer, or rather the individual forced to pen this warning, had access to antiquated supplies. I considered this. Then the letter came from an old institution, a place where such materials are still in use. Holmes nodded approvingly. "Precisely, Watson. The question becomes, where?" Lestrade scoffed. "There must be hundreds of places in London that keep old records." "Not hundreds," Holmes corrected. "A select few." He moved to his bookshelf, retrieving a slim volume on historical document preservation. Flipping through its pages, he stopped at a particular passage. "Legal archives, private collections, and scholarly institutions. But for iron gall ink to remain in circulation, it must be used frequently, not simply stored." I furrowed my brow. "A legal office, then?" Holmes shook his head. "No, such places have long since transitioned to modern inks, but there is one establishment where tradition holds firm." He shut the book with a decisive motion. "The British Library." Lestrade frowned. "You think someone there sent the letter?" "I think," Holmes said, donning his coat, "that within its vast collection we shall find the first trace of our adversary's hand." The British Library, vast and silent, bore the solemn weight of centuries within its walls. As Holmes and I entered, I could not help but feel a certain reverence for the great halls lined with volumes of every age and subject. Holmes, however, had no interest in the grandeur of his surroundings. His sharp eyes sought a single individual among the learned figures moving about the reading room. "There," he murmured, inclining his head toward a bespectacled man hunched over a heavy tome. "Mr. Edwin Hargreaves, a specialist in historical inks and document preservation." At our approach, the librarian looked up, his gaze shifting between us with mild curiosity. Holmes wasted no time in pleasantries and produced the letter from his coat. "Mr. Hargreaves, I require your expertise. This parchment and its ink. What can you tell me of their origin?" The librarian adjusted his spectacles, taking the letter with careful hands. As he scrutinized it, I observed his methodical nature, the way his fingers traced the fibers, the way his lips moved slightly as he read. At length, he gave a quiet hum. "This is an older variety of parchment, commonly used in legal documentation before more modern alternatives became standard," he said. "And the ink, yes, iron gall, a particular mixture no longer in common use." Holmes leaned forward. "And where, Mr. Hargreaves, might one still find such ink in regular use?" The librarian tapped the letter thoughtfully against his palm. "Antique legal archives, without a doubt. There are few places left in London where such materials persist. The most notable among them would be the Old Bailey archives, where centuries of court records are still maintained in their original form." Holmes' eyes glinted. "Of course," he murmured. "The Old Bailey. The very institution that tried and condemned men accused of arson during the Great Fire of London. I started. Holmes, do you mean to say that this is not merely a plot of destruction, but one of historical significance? He turned to me with a faint smile. This is not just about fire, Watson. This is about history. We had scarcely left the British Library when a messenger from Scotland Yard intercepted us, breathless and dishevelled, a note clutched tightly in his hand. Holmes took it, his keen eyes scanning the brief contents before passing it to me. Lestrade. Urgent. Warehouse on the Thames. Immediate attention required. Holmes turned on his heel without a word, and I hurried after him. The urgency in Lestrade's summons left no room for speculation. We hailed a cab, and as we rattled through the mist-laden streets of London, the gas lamps casting distorted glows upon the wet cobblestones, Holmes remained in deep contemplation. Watson, do you recall my concern that this plot was not merely an idle threat, but the prelude to a far greater design? Yes, of course, I replied. You believe history is at the heart of this affair. Indeed. And yet, history is but the kindling. I fear the flames have already been set alight. The moment we arrived at the dockside, Lestrade emerged from the shadows to meet us, his face grim. I sent for you as soon as we discovered it, Holmes. I don't like it one bit. He led us into a vast, empty warehouse, its wooden beams towering high above like the ribcage of some long-dead beast. The air was thick with the acrid scent of oil. I could make out several barrels stacked in clusters, some leaking dark, viscous trails across the floor. A faint shimmer of phosphorus residue lingered on the edges of the containers. A firebomb waiting to be lit, Holmes murmured. And yet, why untouched? Lestrade exhaled sharply. That's not the worst of it. Over here. We followed him to the far wall, where a message had been painted in bold strokes of black ink. Even before I deciphered the words, a chill ran through me. The Latin inscription stood stark against the damp wood. Fiat ignes. Fiat ultio. Let there be fire. Let there be vengeance. I turned to Holmes. He was perfectly still, his gaze fixed upon the inscription. A strange expression flickered across his features, one I had seen only a handful of times before, an emotionless calculation that concealed the cold understanding of something dreadful. Holmes, I said, my voice hushed despite myself, what does this mean? It means, he replied at last, his voice low and steady, that this is no mere act of arson. This is not a warning. This is a reckoning. Holmes remained silent as we left the warehouse, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. Lestrade, trudging alongside us, cast him a sidelong glance. You've seen a good deal of crime, Mr. Holmes, but I've never seen you take to a case quite like this one. Holmes did not immediately answer. He strode forward with purpose, his hands clasped behind his back, his sharp profile cutting through the misty night. It was only when we reached the edge of the docks that he spoke. Inspector, there is something about this affair that troubles me more than its execution, he said. It is its origin. He withdrew his notebook and, with a single stroke, wrote out the words we had found scrawled upon the warehouse wall. Fiat ignes, fiat ultio. This phrase, gentlemen, is no ordinary threat. It is a passage lifted from an obscure sermon delivered in the wake of the Great Fire of London in 1666. The preacher, one Thomas Redburn, was a radical of his time, convinced that the fire was divine retribution upon a city drowning in vice. He believed it was not merely an act of destruction, but of cleansing. Lestrade scoffed. You don't think we're dealing with a man who fancies himself a prophet 300 years later? Holmes regarded him with cool patience. No, Inspector, but I do believe we are dealing with those who have inherited his grievances. I frowned. Holmes, surely you don't mean… The Sons of Pudding Lane, he interrupted, his voice low. A secret society formed in the aftermath of the Great Fire, consisting of those who had lost everything. They believed that the fire was not an accident, nor an act of God, but a deliberate crime committed by the powerful, An early conspiracy, if you will. Lestrade's eyes narrowed. And they still exist. Holmes tapped the page of his notebook. If they did not, we would not be standing here discussing them. I felt a chill despite my overcoat. But why now, Holmes? If their ancestors sought retribution, surely it would have come long ago. Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. That, my dear Watson, is precisely what we must determine. Holmes set a relentless pace as we made our way back to the warehouse on the Thames. Lestrade, struggling to match his long strides, muttered darkly about the futility of returning to a crime scene already picked over, but Holmes paid him no mind. I, for my part, had learned long ago that my friend's instincts, however inscrutable at times, rarely led him astray. The warehouse was just as we had left it, silent, its great wooden beams stretching into darkness like the ribs of a vast carcass. The acrid scent of oil still hung thick in the air, mingling with the dampness of the river. Holmes moved through the space with methodical precision, his gaze sweeping over the barrels of oil and phosphorus stacked in precise rows. He stopped abruptly. "Watson, what do you see?" I frowned. "A great deal of flammable material, arranged for some nefarious purpose." "Precisely." He gestured towards the barrels. "And yet, consider the orderliness of it all. Neatly placed, easily found. An arsonist in haste would not take such care. This is not the chaotic preparation of a criminal about to strike. It is the deliberate arrangement of a display." Lestrade scoffed. "Are you saying this isn't meant to be used?" Holmes turned, his gaze sharp. "I am saying, Inspector, that we were meant to find it." I glanced at the barrels again. The logic of Holmes's argument began to settle over me like a heavy fog. But why leave evidence of an attack if they truly meant to burn London? Holmes exhaled slowly, his fingers tracing the rim of one of the barrels. "Because, my dear Watson, the real fire has already begun elsewhere." Lestrade paled. "Then we've been chasing a diversion?" Holmes's expression was grim. "A carefully constructed one, meant to consume our attention while the true crime unfolds unnoticed. We were never meant to stop it, gentlemen. We were meant to chase shadows." A silence fell between us, broken only by the distant lapping of the Thames against the dock. It was Holmes who spoke first, his voice quiet but resolute. "We have been looking for the fire to start, when in truth, it is already burning." Holmes led us swiftly from the warehouse, his every movement charged with purpose. Lestrade, breathless but determined, kept pace. I could see the consternation in the inspector's face, though whether it stemmed from the implications of Holmes's deductions or the brisk pace at which we moved, I could not say. Back at Scotland Yard, Holmes wasted no time in demanding access to recent reports of fire damage across the city. Lestrade, though accustomed to my friend's abrupt manner, grumbled as he rifled through a stack of documents, extracting a handful of thinly written sheets. "There, if it'll do you any good," he said, tossing them onto the table. "I don't know what you expect to find, Holmes. If London had been going up in flames, I rather think I'd have heard about it." Holmes ignored him, taking up the first report and scanning it with sharp eyes. I peered over his shoulder. The document, brief and unremarkable, detailed a small fire at a storage facility in Suffolk, a location not far from where we now stood. Another paper spoke of a warehouse in Whitechapel, consumed by flames in the early hours of the morning 2 nights prior. Lestrade leaned against the desk, arms folded. "Accidents, I'd wager. Nothing points to arson." Holmes looked up sharply. "Nothing points to arson, Inspector, because nothing is meant to. These fires were not reported in the papers." Lestrade hesitated. "Well, that may be. But why suppress something as mundane as a fire?" Holmes tapped the reports with his forefinger. "Because the moment one fire is acknowledged, the others demand explanation." I felt a cold unease creeping over me. "Are you saying, Holmes, that we are dealing with something far larger than a single plot?" He regarded me steadily. "I am saying, Watson, that the fires have already begun. We have been looking for a threat in the future when the flames are already spreading." A silence fell between us, broken only by the distant ringing of a constable's bell outside. Holmes set the reports down with quiet finality. "Our adversary does not seek to start a fire, gentlemen," he said, his voice grave. "They seek to finish one." The grim toll of the night's discoveries had scarcely settled upon us when Lestrade arrived at Baker Street in a state of considerable agitation. His usual brusqueness was tinged with something graver as he stepped into our sitting room, his hand clenched around a telegram. "There's been another murder, Mr. Holmes. A dock worker found dead not an hour ago, throat slit clean through," he announced, without preamble. "And there's something else." He was clutching this. He withdrew a crumpled fragment of parchment from his pocket and handed it to Holmes. The edges were charred, the surface darkened with soot. Holmes took it without a word, his eyes narrowing as he held it up to the lamp. For a long moment, he examined it in silence, his fingers tracing the brittle edges. Then, in a swift motion, he placed it flat upon the table. "This was deliberately burned," he murmured. "Not by accident, but by design. Someone wished to conceal its contents, yet it was important enough that our unfortunate dock worker held on to it even as he died." I peered over his shoulder. Though much of the parchment was lost to the fire, faint lines and markings remained. A map, perhaps, though what it depicted was unclear. "Where was he found?" Holmes asked. "Near the Limehouse docks," Lestrade replied. "The same area as the warehouse, but I doubt he had anything to do with the Sons of Pudding Lane. He was a common labourer, not a fanatic." Holmes's expression was unreadable. "A common labourer, Inspector, but one who died with an uncommon secret in his hands." He retrieved a magnifying glass and scrutinized the faint markings on the parchment. "This is not the first time I have encountered such lines," he muttered. "Watson, do you recognize the pattern?" I studied the burned edges, the crisscrossing lines, the faint labels still legible beneath the damage. "It resembles— No, it cannot be." Holmes gave a curt nod. "London's underground tunnels," he confirmed. Lestrade straightened. "You mean the old sewer systems?" Holmes's lips curled into a thin smile. "Sewers, Inspector. Number this map traces a path leading to something far more valuable, the vaults beneath the Bank of England." I felt a chill settle over me. This is not just about fire. They mean to burn London while they rob it blind. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him. "And the question remains, who is orchestrating this grand deception, and how deep does the conspiracy go?" The weight of the revelation pressed upon us with an almost tangible force. Holmes, ever a man of action when faced with the final pieces of a puzzle, sprang into motion, his mind already several steps ahead of us. "This is no longer a matter of simple deduction," he announced. "We must now compel our adversary to reveal himself." Lestrade, still reeling from the discovery of the map and its implications, frowned. "And how, pray, do you propose we do that?" Holmes allowed himself a thin smile. "By setting fire to their illusion, Inspector." With that, he reached for his writing desk, swiftly penning a short but calculated statement before sealing it. "This," he said, handing it to Lestrade, "must reach the press immediately." Lestrade hesitated. "And what exactly am I telling them?" "That Scotland Yard has apprehended a key suspect linked to the Sons of Pudding Lane," Holmes said coolly. "A man who, under questioning, has begun to talk." I started. "Holmes, if the true mastermind suspects a betrayal, we may be setting a man's life at risk." Holmes turned his sharp gaze upon me. "A man who deals in fire cannot abide loose embers, Watson. If they believe one of their own has been taken, they will seek to silence him before he can betray them." Lestrade whistled. "So, you mean to lure the real culprit straight into our hands?" "Precisely." Holmes stood, his expression set. "We shall stage a most convincing deception. A suspect will be held within Newgate Prison under heavy guard. The conspirators will have little choice but to act. And when they do, We shall be waiting. Despite myself, I could not suppress a shiver. We had been hunting shadows in a city poised on the brink of disaster. Now, Holmes had thrown down a gauntlet, inviting the true villain to step into the light. And if I knew my friend's mind, he was certain that the trap would be sprung before the night was out. Night had fallen heavy upon London, wrapping the city in a suffocating fog. From our concealed positions within Newgate Prison, we waited in silence, every breath drawn in careful measure. Holmes, standing just beyond the cell that housed our fictitious suspect, was the only one among us who seemed entirely at ease. Lestrade's men had taken their places at every exit, their weapons at the ready, while the inspector himself stood a few paces behind Holmes, gripping his revolver with white-knuckled determination. The minutes crept by, stretching into an agonizing hush. Then, without warning, a flicker of movement disturbed the stillness. A shadow detached itself from the corridor beyond. A hooded figure, slipping through the dim passage like a phantom. He moved with the silent confidence of a man who had planned this course of action well in advance. His steps were deliberate, his approach unwavering. The guards stationed at the far end of the hall had been bypassed without a sound, and now he was upon the cell door, one hand reaching inside his cloak. Before he could act, Holmes stepped forward into the faint glow of the lanterns. A man who creeps in shadows, yet walks with certainty, he said smoothly. Tell me, sir, was your path drawn long ago, or have you merely embraced it by necessity? The figure started, his head snapping up at the sudden intrusion. For the briefest moment, he hesitated. Then, with startling speed, he lunged toward Holmes, a gleaming blade flashing from his sleeve. Holmes, ever the master of calculated movement, sidestepped the attack with infuriating ease. In the same instant, Lestrade's men surged forward. The cloaked man struggled, but the sheer force against him proved insurmountable. Within moments, he was subdued, forced to his knees, and the hood was wrenched from his head. I inhaled sharply. Before us knelt Bartholomew Greaves, a man I recognized from his scholarly lectures, a historian, renowned for his studies on London's Great Fire. Holmes tilted his head, studying the prisoner with a look of almost detached curiosity. Fascinating, he murmured. I could not conceal my own bewilderment. A historian at the heart of an arson conspiracy. Holmes turned his keen gaze upon me. Not just any historian, Watson. A man whose very existence is bound to the ashes of the past. Bartholomew Greaves sat before us, his hands bound, but there was no trace of defeat in his expression. Rather, he exuded a quiet satisfaction. His lips curled into the faintest of smiles. His gaze flickered between us, as though he were an amused spectator, rather than the captured architect of a city's ruin. Lestrade wasted no time. You do well to tell us everything, Greaves, he said gruffly. We have you at the scene, and we know what you were after. Greaves let out a short laugh. Do you? He murmured. Tell me, Inspector, what do you think I was after? Holmes, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward slightly. Vengeance, he said simply. Greaves's eyes gleamed. Ah, Mr. Holmes, at last, someone who understands. Lestrade scoffed. Vengeance? You mean madness. You were prepared to set half of London ablaze. Greaves tilted his head. Not half of London, Inspector. The right pieces of it. Holmes's gaze was fixed upon the prisoner, his fingers pressed together in thought. Your name was familiar to me, Greaves, though I could not place it at first. A historian, a scholar of London's past. But of course your interest in history is more personal, is it not? A slow smile spread across Greaves's face. You've done your research. Holmes's voice remained calm, measured. Your ancestor was Robert Greaves, one of the men falsely accused of starting the Great Fire of London in 1666. He was ruined, his name blackened, his family cast into poverty. The true cause of the fire has been debated for centuries, but your family never sought truth, did they? Only retribution. Greaves leaned back, his expression that of a man entirely at ease. Wouldn't you, Holmes? Wouldn't you, if the weight of injustice had been passed down through generations? My great-great-grandfather died penniless, a man cursed by a city that burned itself to the ground and needed a scapegoat. History has its way of repeating itself, and I thought it only fair to give London a taste of its own fire. I felt a chill settle over me. But this was never about indiscriminate destruction, I murmured. You had a plan, a purpose. Greaves nodded approvingly. You are correct, Doctor. The fire was never meant to consume the whole city, only its heart. The Bank of England, Parliament, the law courts, pillars of power, wealth and justice. They let my ancestor be swallowed by the flames of injustice. I merely sought to return the favour. Lestrade's grip on the edge of the table tightened. And the warehouse fire? A distraction, of course, Greaves said lightly. While your men scurried about, I had others preparing for the real work. Holmes's eyes darkened. And they are still at large. Greaves smirked. Oh, Mr. Holmes, did you truly think I would come alone? Even as the words left Greaves's lips, a sudden rumbling shook the ground beneath us. A distant muffled explosion echoed through the night. Lestrade spun toward the door, his face pale. What in God's name was that? Greaves chuckled. The final act, he said. I do hope you appreciate the symmetry. Holmes was already moving. We rushed outside, emerging onto the street just as a plume of smoke and fire rose in the distance. The bells of St. Paul's Cathedral rang wildly, their solemn tolling swallowed by the growing cries of alarm. Lestrade cursed under his breath. They've done it! Holmes, standing utterly still, surveyed the burning skyline. His voice, when it came, was quiet but edged with ice. Gentlemen, he said, we have little time. The fire at St. Paul's was extinguished before it could consume more than the outer walls of an adjoining building, but the damage, both material and psychological, had been done. London had not burned that night, but the city had glimpsed the peril in which it stood. Greaves and his closest associates were taken into custody within the hour, their plans laid bare, their ambitions thwarted. Lestrade, overseeing the arrests, carried himself with a rare air of satisfaction, though I noted that Holmes observed the proceedings with a more tempered expression. Well, Mr. Holmes, Lestrade said, I believe we've put an end to this particular brand of madness. The sons of Pudding Lane are no more. Holmes, standing beside me, studied the men being led away. You have done well, Inspector, he said. Yet I wonder, have you truly extinguished the fire or merely scattered its embers? Lestrade frowned. What do you mean? Holmes nodded toward the darkened alleys beyond the prison wagons. Not all have been accounted for. Several of Greaves's men vanished in the confusion of the cathedral fire, and I dare say they will not abandon their convictions so easily. Lestrade grunted. We'll find them soon enough. Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. Perhaps. But men like these do not disappear. They recede, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Lestrade exhaled sharply. And what do you suggest? That we hunt ghosts? Holmes shook his head. No, Inspector, merely that you remain vigilant. Smoke lingers long after a fire. They will return when the embers cool. I felt a shiver at his words. The night had ended in our favour, but something in Holmes's tone suggested that this was no final victory, merely the delay of another reckoning yet to come. It was not until we returned to Baker Street, with the case all but closed, that Holmes deigned to explain the full breadth of his deductions. I had long become accustomed to his tendency to keep his reasoning shrouded until all was resolved, but on this occasion, even I had struggled to see the full pattern before it emerged. Seated in his chair, pipe in hand, Holmes gestured to the remnants of the letter that had set the case in motion. Every answer was there from the beginning, he said. The ink, for instance, iron gall, a formula once common, now found only in historical and legal institutions. I nodded. That was our first indication that the writer was not a common criminal, but someone with access to antiquated materials. Precisely, Holmes said. But the ink alone was not enough. It was the phrasing of the letter, the invocation of embers and reckoning, that pointed toward a deeper historical obsession. And then, of course, there was the Latin inscription at the warehouse. Taken from a fire sermon delivered in 1666, I recalled. But how could you be sure Greaves was behind it? Holmes gave me a measured look. Watson, who but a scholar of the Great Fire would have both the knowledge and the motive? The sermon was obscure, known only to those who had studied the accounts in depth. And Greaves, as we discovered, had done more than study the fire. He had spent a lifetime fixated upon it. Lestrade, who had joined us for a final debriefing, shifted in his seat. And the barrels in the warehouse? Ah, Holmes said, his lips curling slightly. That was the simplest deception of all. The placement was far too methodical, too easily discovered. A true arsonist does not lay his fire so neatly at the feet of his pursuers. It was meant to be found, meant to distract us from the true crime. Lestrade rubbed his chin. So the real plot was never arson, it was robbery. Precisely, Holmes said. Greaves and his men did not seek to burn London. They sought to steal from it. The fires were never the goal, only the means to keep the city's watchful eyes elsewhere while they moved unseen beneath it. I exhaled, finally seeing the design in its full scope. A masterful deception. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Indeed, Watson. But as with all illusions, it required but one crack for the whole facade to crumble. The embers of the night's events still smouldered in our thoughts as we sat in Lestrade's office at Scotland Yard, the weight of what had transpired pressing upon us. Holmes, ever detached, occupied himself by examining a tobacco-filled pipe he had borrowed from the inspector's desk, while Lestrade himself stood at the window, staring out into the dim glow of the street lamps. You know, Lestrade said finally, his voice quieter than usual. I don't mind admitting that if it weren't for you, Holmes, London might have been in flames before we knew where to look. Holmes did not acknowledge the praise. He tapped the pipe against his palm thoughtfully. These threats are never as distant as we like to imagine, Inspector. They are always waiting, smouldering just beneath the surface, ready for the right wind to stir them to life. Lestrade exhaled and turned toward us. But that's just it, isn't it? If men like Greaves can plan something of this scale without raising an alarm, who's to say another won't try again? Holmes merely inclined his head, neither confirming nor denying the inevitability of such a thing. I shifted in my chair, my thoughts still tangled in the horror of it all. What I cannot fathom, I admitted, is how a man of intellect and learning, an educated scholar, could devote himself so wholly to destruction. Greaves was no common criminal. He did not seek wealth or chaos for its own sake, and yet he pursued this course as if it were his life's work. Holmes, setting the pipe aside, studied me with something almost akin to amusement. Ah, Watson, he said, you seek reason where there is none to be found. I frowned. Then you believe him to be mad? Holmes turned his gaze toward the window, where the city lay beyond in quiet slumber, blissfully unaware of how near it had come to ruin. His voice, when it came, was quiet and measured. Revenge is but history rewritten, Watson, though it rarely improves the prose. We left Scotland Yard as dawn began to break, the thick London mist curling about the streets like the dying breath of the night's turmoil. There was something strangely serene about the city in that moment. Unaware, unchanged, oblivious to how close it had come to catastrophe. As we walked in silence toward Baker Street, I found my thoughts lingering upon Holmes's words. Civilization, for all its grandeur, seemed fragile. its foundations far more delicate than I had ever considered. The great cities of the world, their towers rising ever higher, seemed to me now as if they rested upon kindling, awaiting only the right spark. Beside me, Holmes strode with the same unhurried gait as always, as though the night had been no more than an intellectual exercise. I envied his ability to detach himself from such things, while I could not shake the lingering weight of it all. "You are lost in thought, Watson." I hesitated before speaking. I was merely considering how history might have recorded tonight had we failed. It strikes me as strange how little the world knows of its own narrow escapes. Holmes nodded. "Yes, Watson, but history, you see, does not trouble itself with close calls. It remembers only what is written in its final chapter." We turned onto Baker Street, the familiar warmth of home drawing near. The gas lamps flickered, their glow reflecting in the dampened streets, and in that moment, Holmes slowed, his sharp eyes fixed upon some distant thought. "There is no madness, Watson," he murmured, almost to himself. "Only men who believe themselves the authors of history when they are but its footnotes." The city slept on, undisturbed. Holmes and I sat in silence at Baker Street, the fire in the hearth flickering low, casting shifting shadows against the walls. Outside, the city stirred, oblivious to the disaster it had so narrowly escaped. I leaned forward, breaking the hush between us. "Holmes, do you truly believe we have seen the last of the sons of Pudding Lane?" Holmes exhaled a thin wisp of smoke from his pipe, his expression unreadable. "History, Watson, does not grant such comforts. It is not a book that closes with the final page, but a manuscript constantly rewritten by the hands of men who refuse to let the past rest." I shuddered. "And Greaves?" Holmes turned his gaze toward the window, where the morning fog rolled through the streets. He was not the first man to believe he could rewrite London's fate with fire, nor, I fear, will he be the last. He tapped his fingers idly against the armrest, his mind already drifting elsewhere. "The real question, Watson, is not whether they will return, but whether we shall recognize the smoke before the fire takes hold." Holmes unravelled Greaves' deception before London could burn. But what do you think was the criminal's greatest mistake? Was it his arrogance, his reliance on secrecy, or something hidden in the details of his plan? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this case, subscribe for more Sherlock Holmes mysteries, and be sure to share the story with fellow mystery lovers. The game is always afoot, and there are more secrets waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, keep your wits sharp and your lanterns burning.